Jamie Berry, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
I feel like it's bring your best friend to school day.
It is a bit like that, maybe.
It is a little bit like that. For anyone who's listening that didn't come to the Sydney leg of the Aussie Tour event, they won't know you, or you won't know who Jamie Berry is. But Jamie Berry's become quite famous in the Sydney coffee scene since the Map It Forward Aussie Tour. Jamie, why don't you tell people who you are and what you do?
So I am a clinical neuropsychologist. I've been working as one for the best part of 2 decades. So I do assessments and treatment with people who have acquired brain disorders or other forms of brain disorder. That includes mental health phenomena, traumatic brain injuries, hypoxic brain injuries, developmental disorders, and that's my passion and my joy. Helping people is what drives me do what I do. And I also enjoy research, and most of my hobbies are linked to my profession as a neuropsychologist, except for a couple, and we might get to them. But yeah, that's pretty much me.
I have no idea what direction this conversation is going to take us. For context, when people might be thinking like, why the fuck does Lee have a neuropsychologist on the Map It Forward podcast? So Jamie and I have been friends since we were 10, which is a number of decades now. And we spend, hours in conversation talking about pretty much everything that we can think of. And this podcast is about conversations, really cool, interesting conversations. And of all the podcasts I've done, this is the one I've probably been most excited about. Just because Jamie and I don't have conversations in front of people, really. We don't even have conversations face to face very much anymore because we both live in different countries. And so actually having a conversation with you, Jamie, while I'm looking at you, feels strange right now.
Yeah.
But I'm sure we'll suffer through it.
Yeah, we'll get there somehow.
We'll get there.
As I told you off air, I don't know that I'm capable of thinking and sitting for 2 hours. Most of the conversations we have are during my Saturday morning walks.
Yes.
So I may feel compelled to get up at some point if my cogs aren't turning.
We will absolutely accommodate that situation. Most people are going to be listening to this podcast rather than watching this podcast. So
good.
I get fed so deeply by our conversation. So this is going to be a lot of fun. I want to talk to you about the workshop I don't know what we call it, the presentation that you gave, the workshop, whatever, around assertiveness and mindfulness in the workplace last year at the Sydney leg of the Map It Forward Aussie Tour. It was hands down and by far everybody's favourite session. Did that surprise you?
It did. I was a little bit apprehensive that I may not have had anything to talk about that would connect with your audience, but you seem to have a higher degree of confidence than I did that there would be some sort of connection. And it was actually one of the presentations or group sessions I've facilitated that ended up generating quite a lot of engagement, probably more so than my typical group. So yeah, it was really a lot of fun, and a lot of people came up to me afterwards and had questions building on the material. So I really enjoyed it, and I was surprised that I could add any value to a group of baristas and other coffee people.
I mean, it was so popular. I didn't want to let you get off the stage. You ended up taking a 1-hour session and it went for 2 hours, which was it was wonderfully strange because, here I am beating my chest at my fabulous friend, and people were like, why are you having a psychologist talk to us? I'm like, just wait. Honestly, just wait. And then everyone kept saying to me how they had no idea how much they needed to understand assertiveness. And you and I, in our many conversations, have talked about the importance of assertiveness and what we think it could do for the world, not just the coffee industry. But when we talk about how dumbfounded, well, I'm going to own this one. When I talk about how dumbfounded I am by how many fucking stupid people there are out there, you don't say that, I say that. And I am constantly lost at how terrible people are at communicating. And when people say that they wanted something but didn't know how to ask for it, or why didn't the other person just assume that that's what I wanted? Like all of these passive behaviors.
Yep.
And it's so prevalent in our industry, Jamie. I mean, I've experienced things in the workplace where bosses have just been super passive aggressive or very aggressive in that kind of environment. And I've had people be very aggressive with me in the workplace purely because they couldn't communicate. Can you tell us a little bit, for people who didn't attend the session in Sydney, tell us a little bit about assertiveness?
Okay, so firstly, I don't think that what you're saying is unusual in the population at large. And I learned only recently, actually, that assertiveness training is one of the most common things that clinical psychologists do with their clients all around the world. So to describe what it is, basically it's a behaviour or a behaviour style. And assertiveness can be contrasted against passive behaviour on the one hand and aggressive behaviour on the other. And the model that I outlined or proposed in that session was, imagine a seesaw, and at the fulcrum, at the midpoint of the seesaw, you've got assertiveness, which is a balance point, and at one extreme end you've got aggressive behaviour, and at the other extreme you've got passive behaviour. And what aggressive and passive behaviour represent are the preference you have for violating rights. So if you have a preference of being in the world and getting your needs met by violating the rights of other people, you are being aggressive. And if your mode of being in the world is to allow your own rights to be violated at the for the purpose of other people having their rights met, then you're being passive. And so assertiveness is where you can express yourself openly, clearly, and honestly without violating the rights of other people. Because what passive people tend to do, or people with a passive style, is they won't verbalise or vocalise openly, honestly, and clearly what they want, because they don't think that what they want is as important as what other people want. Therefore, they're allowing other people to violate their rights to speak up or have their needs met. And so that's the model I use in my clinical practice to help people understand the contrast between aggressive and passive behaviour and how assertiveness fits into that. And it's at that fulcrum point because the ideal state to aim for, if you're interested in becoming more assertive, is to not violate the rights of others and not violate your own rights.
Which is such an important challenge for people to accept for themselves. Like, you've watched me over a couple of years now be very focused on becoming more assertive. And because I was somebody who grew up, because of my culture, and, I want to talk about tribalism in a second around this. The way I was raised in the Arab or Australian Arab community is that you sacrifice yourself for the tribe.
Right.
And, everybody comes before you because it's a mark of humility. And, you are, your heritage is Egyptian. You've been around that. behavior that wasn't what you were modeled. And you're such an assertive person. It's so wonderful to see it modeled, because few people in my life are able to model assertive behavior effectively. And you've watched me learn how to do that, and I struggled big time with it. And I got to say, seeing that seesaw in that presentation was the final part of it that really clicked for me. And it it brings into play the other thing that we talk about and that I'm working very heavily on, is this thing about boundaries. Is boundaries an essential part of assertiveness?
I think the two go together. So in terms of how boundaries plays into assertiveness, actually I'll deal with something else you touched on, which is the cultural difference, because that's relevant. In communal cultures, such as the one that you were raised in, then boundaries are very porous or loose, because it's the tribe or the community or the family that has precedence over determining what action to take next. And so it serves those cultures to not have boundaries, and in fact not to have assertiveness. Assertiveness comes out of a very individualistic cultural framework, which, the assumption is if you live in America, Australia, the UK and other Western countries, that's the modus operandi, where the individual is valued as the most reduced volitional agent in the world, right? So things happen at the individual level. Individuals can congregate and form collectives and groups, and they can have their own identity and persona and values and goals and all the rest of it. But things matter at the individual level if you live in a liberal Western democracy. And so assertiveness really comes out of that heritage, in that you're talking about individual rights, and the assumption of assertiveness is that every individual has a right to speak up, has a right to express their needs, and do what's reasonable and legal and ethical to get those needs met. Now, in a communal culture, you don't necessarily start with those assumptions. Individuals may not have that level of inherent freedoms. And so there are many cultures where, example, if the individual does something shameful, the expected thing would be for that individual to end their life, because that individual behaviour and individual life is not as important as the group. And to respect the integrity at the group level, then that individual is expected to either go away from the group or end their life. So cultures are very interesting kind of top-down
pressure. Does that
shit
fascinate you?
Yeah, I love it. I love trying to understand it, but I haven't even begun to understand or think about these things cross-culturally very much. But I do find that it is particularly difficult for me to do assertiveness training when dealing with people from those collectivist cultures, because it's just such a foreign idea. And it's a foreign idea because they don't start with the premise that individuals have rights necessarily. And I'm generalising, but you get my drift.
Oh, I can absolutely identify with that. Yeah.
So getting back to boundaries and how that relates to assertiveness, well, if your boundary is you as an individual, then it's easier for you to stick up for your rights or impose your rights and all the rest of it. But if the boundary is the group, not you, then by definition, you can't be assertive. The group might be able to be assertive, but you as an individual can't and shouldn't be assertive, because there isn't a boundary around you. You're part of that collective whole.
And you're breaking the rules,
Yeah.
right? Like it's a twisted web that you're conditioned into the cultural framing of how the web of rules works in every part of your life. And so you can't do anything to shame the group. If you do something to shame the group, you either have to atone very publicly or you'll be ousted. And so, when you say that having boundaries is very individualistic, is there a relationship between that and people's political preferences? Like, are people who are more right? I know you said that it's a liberal trait, but it would make sense to me that it would be something that would make people swing more to the right, libertarians and such.
That's a good question, Lee. You're good at posing good questions. I don't know is the answer.
The advantage. It's the evening. This is a very rare conversation for us where the times are flipped. You picked the advantage on me this time.
I don't know the answer to that, and the way I'm starting to think about a response is, and you and I have spoken about this before, this concept of groupishness versus selfishness. And I think you can get groupishness either side of the political divide if you're dividing it as left versus right. I think you're going to more likely get political differences when you divide it along big government, small government type lines.
Tell me more.
You mentioned libertarianism. So to me, libertarianism means minimal involvement of the government in people's lives. So minimal regulation, minimal laws, and all the rest of it. And big government people want much more intervention from the government. I would expect possibly a difference in assertiveness across those divides, with people who want big government and more collectivist sorts of policies that benefit groups more, perhaps to be less assertive than libertarians, who would probably be more comfortable making an argument of what I would like and what I wouldn't like. Maybe. I don't know.
That's interesting, because when you think about it, a libertarian is saying, don't fucking cross my boundaries. I don't want you coming anywhere near.
That's right.
Which would suggest that somebody who is a libertarian is quite boundaried. You hear people like Ben Shapiro talk about libertarianism quite a lot, because he's like, you should be, the government should be running things that keep order to an extent, like, which way people should drive on the roads and, traffic lights and things like that. But you shouldn't be telling people who they can marry and who they can't marry.
Right. Yep. That's exactly right. So, I think you're right that the adage of don't tread on me, which I think comes straight out of the Libertarian Handbook, is a very assertive statement. It's like, do whatever you want to do. That's fine. I'm not going to criticise you. Power to you, but don't cross this boundary and don't tell me what I can and can't do. I think that's a very assertive way of being in the world. Obviously, it can be flipped to become aggressive if the words aren't quite right. But essentially, I think you're right, and surprisingly, we haven't touched on that one before. We've just uncovered a nice.
This is new one for us. Yeah. We will process this one over the next coming days and have another conversation on Saturday about it.
Look, it'll make a really good study, and the person who would, if he hasn't already done the study, would be very interested in doing it, and that's Jonathan Haidt. As you know, he's one of my
we both love him.
Heroes. Yep. Because he's obviously interested in moral psychology, and that's a lot about political inclinations or leanings. And as a psychologist, he'd certainly be right across assertiveness and what that is and what that isn't. And so it would be a very simple study. You could do it online via online surveys. You basically give an assertiveness questionnaire and then give a political inclination questionnaire and see if there's a correlation. My prediction is it would correlate more across the libertarian versus big government divide than the left versus right divide.
You know, I have noticed that the more assertive and the more boundaried I've gotten, the more anxiety I experience.
Oh, that's interesting. Why?
Yeah. Well, because the more boundaried I'm getting, the more I'm letting go of my safety net, right? So I'm sure as I get comfortable with my boundaries, and like right now, I'm only a few years into being quite boundaried and quite assertive. And I still surprise myself with how many fuck yous I can say to somebody who steps over my boundaries. And I'm noticing
that might be reaching into aggression a little bit, possibly.
Well, I don't say fuck you.
Right, but metaphorical.
Metaphorical fuck you in the sense that, you know, I remember when I was going through my divorce and my ex-husband and I were in with a counselor. She asked him to leave the session, the last 15 minutes. And she said to me, my dear, there's going to come a day when you're going to learn how to say fuck you properly.
Wow.
And you won't need to say it out loud, but you will learn how to say fuck you. And I can't wait for that to happen because you're a powerhouse now and you still let people walk all over you. But wait till you learn how to say fuck you. And she's right. She's absolutely right. But what I found is that the more I'm stepping into this new behavior, even though it's a couple of years in, I've spent so many years being unboundaried and living for the tribe, that this idea of putting myself, I even struggle to say it, putting myself first and asserting myself. I still feel a sense of guilt behind that, but it's like I can talk the guilt down. It's
Right.
like guilt versus shames. Shout out to Brene Brown here and all the work that she's been doing around guilt and shame and compassion and all of that, because it's really helped me realize that shame is not effective, neither is guilt. You know, it's one of those things of if you've been conditioned towards living tribally and that doesn't fit you, like it doesn't make sense, that breakaway is really difficult. That breakaway is the transitionary process to that. You've got to cut yourself some slack and just like sit in it. And right now I'm still in the transition. And every time someone like butts up against me and I'm forcing myself to hold my boundary, because like, you know me, I'm a very rational person. I'm like someone who has high integrity standards for myself. I'm never going to fuck someone over. I'm never, ever going to consider like I have to achieve something here that hurts somebody else. And so I can trust that, but I still feel guilty for it. So if somebody butts up against me, I have to talk myself into this. No, hold up. Like you're not holding this boundary because you want to be stubborn or a bitch or anything like that. This person's trying to screw you over. And you deserve not to have that behavior in your life.
That's right. So if someone's trying to screw you over, and then they're being aggressive to you,
yeah.
And so why would you feel guilty at defending yourself?
Because, and I know that I can see the dismay in your face. I usually hear it in your voice only, but seeing the dismay in your face, because if you're conditioned to put up with that behavior, it's not unusual that people would treat you that way.
Yeah, see, that's the level, the conditioning, if that's the end result of it, well, I'll say it quite frankly, the conditioning is conditioning for you to be manipulated, because that's clearly what that's about. If you're conditioned to accept people doing bad by you, get out of that situation. Like take a step back, take a bird's eye appraisal of the situation, see it for what it is. And it's when you're in it,
itself is difficult, Jamie.
Yeah, I know. When you're in it, it can be hard to see it for what it is. But that's what good therapy does. It gives you a different perspective, and possibly some vocabulary to understand things that you just accept as normal as perhaps being not quite the norm, but more importantly, not helpful. And in modern psychology, a big part of being helpful is simply identifying helpful environments and helpful behaviours. And if you're in that sort of environment, whether it's a conditioned one or not, where that's acceptable or the norm, I would be a strong advocate for taking a different perspective and challenging that. And part of the challenging process is not just saying it's bad, you should all, it should all change, but proposing a viable alternative solution or environment.
And an exit strategy. Like, you don't have to just decide, I got to leave right now. You can put a strategy, a strategy in place so that you're not doing further harm to yourself. Like, first of all, if you're in an environment that's actually harmful to you, you do need to get out straight away.
Yep, that's right. So I've lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else about that. No, that's all right. But yeah, starting to challenge it can be very hard, and a big part of that is seeing it from a different perspective. Anyway,
I have a question for you.
I can't regain it. Yeah.
What's the relationship between aggressive people and insecurity?
Generally speaking, and this is just a generalisation, they're both correlated. They're positively correlated. So insecure people will tend to be more aggressive. That's not to say that all aggressive people are insecure. And part of that insecurity comes from, well, actually, I'll deal with it the other way. The aggression is, for some individuals, is rooted in a low or a poor self-concept, and the aggression is about pointing the finger at others when things go wrong. That's actually a better description of someone who's angry, because when you're angry, you're perceiving injustice. So if we take an everyday example, let's say you're just walking around your house and you stub your toe on something. Now, the angry person is going to probably have a thought such as, why did such and such put that there, right? The blame is externalized straight away. That they don't have enough self-reflection to appreciate that there are some other factors in there, such as, well, why didn't you just perceive that thing and walk around it, right? But an angry, an aggressive person generally won't have that introspection. They won't have that self-questioning because possibly they've got some insecurities about what might come up if they ask those questions. And so when things go wrong, it's always someone else's fault.
They don't take ownership.
Yeah, that's the angry mindset default, and anger and aggression are associated, but anger is the emotion, aggression is the behavioural manifestation that might arise from that emotion. Now, that's a really interesting point when it comes to assertiveness training, because often I'll have clients who say, oh, I don't want to be an angry person. And my provocative question back to them is, why not? Anger is a very helpful emotion. And then that begs them asking, well, how is it helpful? Well, it's helpful because anger gives you the energy to deal with a perceived injustice. Now, if your perception is on the mark and there is actually an injustice, it's a good idea to summon your energy to do something about it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you act out aggressively. You can summon that energy, for example, to construct or write a very assertive letter or statement to address that injustice. So the anger itself is not the problem. The emotion is actually a very healthy emotion. But how you then enact that in behaviour is where people just conflate anger and aggression. They don't want to be an angry person. They don't see themselves as an angry person. And that can be a variable that keeps them passive because they're so afraid of being perceived as being angry or aggressive that they never say, no, I'm not going to do that. that's not an angry or aggressive statement in and of itself. It's a statement of how I openly and honestly feel. No, I don't want to do that. Now, you're going to butt heads when you get to when as a person develops assertiveness. If they're coming from the passive end of the spectrum, they're going to start butting heads with others. And a big mistake that people make is that it's an all or nothing position. So let's say someone wants you to do something, you really don't want to do it. So the assertive response is, no, I'd rather not do that. Now, the other part of assertiveness that people miss out is sometimes it's about negotiation. It's not just about, no, I don't want to do it, therefore it's not going to happen. It might be, no, I don't want to do that, but I can see that on this occasion it's really important to you that I do it, so I'll do it this once, but it's not something I want to make a habit of or do ever again. So that's still assertive, because you're going to have to negotiate some differences from time to time.
And if you're not used to doing it, it can be so anxiety inducing practicing these things when you don't have that as your normal conditioning. I'm in a situation that you know about. I recently hired in air quotes. I've had terrible luck with salespeople. And I recently had a situation where I was speaking to somebody about bringing them on board as a salesperson, and had told them the history that I'd had, and I was so done with people promising shit that they couldn't deliver. And he was so excited about the opportunity to work for Elixir, and had told me that he had the intention of one day either buying the company or running the company. And I was so excited about his passion, but was quietly apprehensive because he didn't have any sales experience. But the thing that he did have that he brought to the role was that he was a rich kid and had access to the people in his everyday life that would be Elixir customers. And I was very clear with him that I knew he didn't have experience in sales, but confirmed with him that he was interested in learning how to do it and that he could deliver on the things that he said he could deliver on.
Yeah.
And I made a deal with him that if he really wanted this job, I had been, like, you knew how much it had floored me the last 8 months of a lot of the shit that I've gone through. And I said to him, I just wasn't prepared to pay another employee up front that couldn't deliver on what they said that they could deliver. So I said to him, if he works the first 2 months and proves to me that he could do it, I was going to pay him whatever he wanted after that.
Right.
But he had to prove to me that he could deliver. And it wasn't going to take very long at all for him to prove to me that he could deliver. In the first month of working for me, and I didn't really even see it that he was working for me, because he took 12 days off. Now, after the first week, if I had have known that he was, look, I gave him the benefit of the doubt, thinking he had lots of personal shit going on. He guilted me into, I promise I'm going to get better. I promise I'm going to get better. And at that point, I was like, well, this is why I said I didn't want to pay someone for the first 2 months of their work until they could prove what they could do. But he was guaranteed 10% in exchange for that first 2 months, 10% of the revenue that we earned that year as a form of gratitude. That was the payoff for the first 2 months.
Right.
He agreed to it and everything. He did such a fucking terrible job, and it took so much energy from me to have to motivate him, to keep him engaged, to get him to turn up to meetings. I kept saying to him, like, this is not okay. This is not professional. I don't see that we should keep working together. I'd mentioned that to him a couple of times. You need to tell me if your heart's not in it. And, you know, it got to the point where I said to him, I don't think this is going to work out at the end of the first month. One day I said to him, we really need to have a conversation about where you're going with this, because I don't have any proof of any of the work that you say that you're done. He was so, I don't like this word, but it's befitting. He was so triggered by me trying to hold him accountable to his words that he didn't turn up to work for a whole week. And so when he did turn up, he said, I'm ready to go. I'm excited. Let's make this happen. I'm like, no, buddy. No, this isn't how this is going to go down. I've gone so far over what I said I would tolerate with you because you were having all these personal problems. And you've now crossed the boundary so far that it's now I'm the fool if I was to take you on board. Now he's telling me that he requires payment for his work. And this has been a real, I guess, exercise for me in staying staunch by my boundaries. You know, he is trying very hard to bully me. You know, I'm going to bring out a lawsuit against you. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And it's intimidating. I'm not going to lie. It's intimidating because I know the tactic and I understand what he's doing. And these kinds of situations are still difficult for me to deal with because I am such an anxiety, you know, I've lived with anxiety my whole life. So I'm a high functioning human that lives with anxiety. But just the idea of, listen, Lee, you haven't done anything wrong. You had a verbal agreement with this guy and he was the one who, he fucked up. You went way over what anyone should be expected to do to make this guy's life possible, like this position possible. You're a clear communicator. You know that you're a good communicator. What's the problem? And it's just that kind of thing, like learning how to have boundaries and trusting that you communicated them. You know, you and I have talked about Jonathan Haidt's work around the coddling of the American mind. And that is very much in play here. And it scares me to death at the future of what the workplace is going to look like when at the suggestion of somebody being required to be accountable for the words they're going to say, it's just going to be too hard for people and they're going to fall apart, and you as an employer are going to be considered as an aggressor for that kind of a thing. I mean,
that's right.
You know what I mean? It's that kind of a time now.
It's a massive problem. I don't know the size of the problem, and a lot of it is, according to Jonathan Haidt's work, a cohort effect. So there are intergenerational differences in tolerance for rules, structure, and accountability. And generally older people of, I don't know at which stage it starts, but Gen X,
baby boomers
and baby boomers are probably more likely to be able to tolerate constructive feedback and to acknowledge wrongs when they commit them, and to be generally more accountable than younger people. And I think it's Gen Z. It's the iGen. So I think people born from 1995 onwards that are less likely to do that. And his thesis is they've been coddled, and part of the coddling has been the fact that, at least in American culture, and I think a lot of it generalises to Australia, is that through the from the 1980s and certainly in the 1990s and onwards, there has more often than not in school playgrounds been teachers around So I think that was mandated sometime in the early to mid-80s. And so kids always had someone to complain about if they felt wronged. And so they had also a reduced opportunity to resolve those conflicts themselves or take responsibility when they've done the wrong. And so because they're lacking those opportunities, then the inclination for those cohorts is to complain to someone, and that someone could be the university dean, or it could be the principal, or it could be the government. And that's how, of course, again, I'm generalizing, but that's how that cohort has learnt to resolve problems, to just keep taking it up the chain rather than spending more time dealing directly with whatever the problem is, which in some cases involves accepting that you've done the wrong thing. It's not the end of the world.
They expect somebody to take care of it for them.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. So they simply haven't had enough practice at, part of it is assertive, at assertively resolving disputes. And it's such an important life skill. And yeah, I don't know how that's going to go, how it's going to play out when they get older. But we're already seeing some systematic trends, especially in the universities, with how that's playing out. They're demanding a lot more, and they're not necessarily delivering what's expected of them. And then when they're brought to account of why they haven't delivered what's expected of them, then there seems to be always some backup reasons or excuses for that. And employers or people in positions of authority are very quickly losing the ability to then keep those mentors accountable. And I don't think it's a good way for our societies to go.
Well, I think what's possibly going to happen is that we're going to end up with a situation where people who are used to being held accountable and holding people accountable are just going to be fed up. Like, I'm so at the brink of never wanting to hire anybody again. It's just to get this guy to have a conversation with me. He will not have a conversation with me. I'm like, listen, bro, like, can we just sit and talk about this? No.
By the way, that is classic aggressive behaviour. So not engaging in a conversation is aggressive because you're not giving the other person the right to be heard.
And when I say I'm not going to be bullied by you, it's completely ignored, as though it's completely dismissed. Bro, you are threatening me with legal action. You didn't fucker deliver on anything that you said that you were going to do. You in 1 month, you made 0 sales. You barely turned up to the meetings that we were supposed to have. To hold you accountable to a spreadsheet where you filled in the work that you had to do was like extracting molars from someone's mouth. It was so stressful. And his response to that is, well, that's your job as the boss.
Oh, wow.
And so for someone like me who's learning how to live without the safety net of a tribe, and who's trying to feel that I deserve the boundaries that I'm instilling in my life, it's a huge learning curve. I wish that I could get to a point where the anxiety went away. I don't know if that will happen, but I'm sure the more confidence I get around this, the more, and you and I have talked about this before, I'm sure my over empathy doesn't help at all in this. And I want to talk to you here about this idea of gender and our programming around the way, like, I've spoken about it on this podcast before, the way that our tendencies are as a gender, and the way that we naturally tend to respond. What role does that play in assertiveness? Are men more likely to be assertive than women?
Yes, hands down. Men are also more likely to be aggressive than women. It's a fairly consistent finding.
And women are more likely to be passive?
Correct. Yep.
Just before all the social justice warriors have a fucking go at me, that's shown in the science?
Yeah. Yep.
Great, thank you.
Indisputable.
I had to cover my ass there.
Yeah, well, it's shown in the science, but what I was going to say is I'm not sure if that's shifted over time, but certainly, historically that's been the case. And a big part of it is conditioning. Men are encouraged to speak up more and do things more aligned with either being aggressive or assertive. And in traditional cultures, women less so. So, yeah, you do get those differences. The important thing to recognise, though, is assertiveness is a skill. It can be learnt by anyone, and you can start anywhere along that spectrum and still develop the skill and well, maybe not perfect it, because it's hard to perfect. It's hard to be assertive, actually, all of the time in every circumstance. But
can I while you're there, can I read you a quote by Cardi B? Do you know who Cardi B is, Jamie Berry?
Vaguely. she's some sort of Hollywood person, a performer, a rapper.
You don't know the words to Zodiac Yellow? Come on now.
I don't, Lee. You know me.
For anyone who doesn't know, Jamie was also the bass player in my band. So we have a music relationship there too. But she says, this is coming from the New York Times gender Instagram, and I saw this yesterday and I thought, oh, I've got to remember this for my conversation with you today. And she says, women are so timid. A lot of girls ask me, how do I get what I want? By asking.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that's the epitome of assertiveness.
Absolutely. Well, yes, asking is an important part of it. I would start a step before that, and that is in knowing what you want. And it still surprises me, Lee, how many people haven't even got to that step.
Tell me more about that.
People don't know what they want. They don't know what they want.
In life, in their careers, from themselves, from other people, or all of the above?
Yeah, all of the above. So a lot of my work involves helping people achieve their goals, and to know what the goals are, the person needs to be very clear about what they want. And I think it's because people spend a lot of time avoiding what they don't want, that they then don't spend enough time thinking what they do want. So
say that again. People spend a lot of time
thinking about what they don't want, right? What they need to avoid, right? So in the context of anxiety that you've mentioned a couple of times, well, whatever the person's anxious about, that's what they want to avoid. And the more anxious a person is, the more they're consumed by that thing that they want to avoid. And the classic and most common thing that people want to avoid is embarrassment in social contexts. And so, think of and I'm sure if it hasn't applied to you, it's probably applied to someone you know. You're going to a party or you're going to an event. There's a lot of people there you don't know. The average person will have some thoughts, not necessarily be consumed by them, but they'll have some thoughts along the lines of, I hope I don't say something embarrassing, or I hope I don't give them the wrong impression.
Or I hope somebody talks to me.
I hope someone talks to me. I hope I'm not left alone. So there's all these thoughts about what I don't want to happen, that there's very little mental airtime given to, well, what do I want out of this meeting?
Yeah.
What could really help me in terms of my longer term goals, or maybe I can just let loose tonight and enjoy myself. That's what I want. And if people go into situations like that, knowing what they want and thinking more about what they actually want rather than what they want to avoid, well, they're going to have more of a goal-setting mindset, and they're going to find those things that they want. The mind just has an amazing way of filtering whatever you program it with. So if the program is avoid social embarrassment at all costs, well, that person is only going to focus on the risk of social embarrassment throughout that event. But if you program the mind with, well, I'm looking for some networking opportunities, well, that's what the mind's going to find. And it's just, I mean, people talk about this in non-scientific ways as, you know, the power of the mind and all that. Yeah, which is all well and good because it's backed by the science, actually, right? There's way too much to pay attention to at any given moment in any given situation, externally and internally. And you're going to essentially pay attention to those things that you either want or the things that you want to avoid. So, yeah, people generally don't know what they want because they're too busy avoiding what they don't want. So the first step to assertiveness is know what you want. All right? What do you want from this meeting or this interview or whatever it is? What is it you actually want? And I can spend a whole 50-minute session helping a person discover that thing. It's not necessarily obvious or apparent to a lot of individuals. Once you know what you want, I think the whole assertive thing becomes very, very easy.
It falls into place.
It falls into place, and the challenge that you've described, which is, you know, you get intimidated. There's intimidation directed towards you. You feel anxious. I think that can be helped by spending a bit more time thinking about what do you actually want. Now, in the situation you've described, well, you don't want a legal case, I presume, right? That's something you don't want. What do you want? It would be my question in this kind of dispute.
And I thought about it very clearly in the sense that, okay, so what's the best outcome here, Lee? Like, I don't want him to feel fucked over, and I don't want me to feel fucked over.
Hang on, I'll pause you there.
Yeah.
Why the first one?
Because of my over empathy and compassion and all of that kind of stuff. No, but it's important to me that I come out with, I don't need to squash somebody else to attain what I want. At the end of the day, I want to pay him for the work that he did. I want him to,
which is zero, right?
Well, so he turned up to some meetings. He turned up on orientation day. There are a couple of meetings that he turned up to over the phone. He filled out a spreadsheet at some point that wasn't complete. He didn't maintain it. But so I've said to him, I will pay you 2 days for 2 days work over a month. He wants 2 full weeks worth of pay.
Okay. So let me just strip it back.
Yeah.
The reason I paused you there and queried that is I'm not going to use exactly your terminology, but it was you don't want him to feel hard done by.
Yeah.
Why? Why are you taking responsibility for how he feels? Why shouldn't he take that responsibility?
Oh, I like that, Jamie Berry.
Yeah.
I really like that. I feel like that lifts some anxiety. Like, it's not my fucking problem, bro, to figure out how you should or shouldn't feel right now.
That's exactly right. And
I like that.
And it's a kind of classic manifestation of the more passive end of the spectrum, that a person who's used to being passive will want to take responsibility for other people's emotions. Now, emotions provide information. Sometimes they're valid, sometimes they're invalid. When I say they're invalid is we know on the basis of probabilities, for example, that the probability of dying from a spider bite in Australia is so low, and it's hardly ever happened in the last 100 years, but the feeling of anxiety around spiders that a lot of people have, well, it's a real feeling, but it's not actually giving you high fidelity information. The information is distorted because it feels a lot worse than it actually is. right?
Yeah.
So what a lot of modern psychology is concerned with is making a clear distinction between what is and what something feels like, and treating them as separate things. And so when you say the outcome you want is you don't want him to feel hard done by, well, firstly, that's a matter for him. That's not inside your boundary. You just need to be concerned with what's inside your boundary. So I think it's more valid to be concerned that he isn't hard done by, right? So there's a justice element.
Fairness.
You want a fair outcome. And what you consider to be fair pre or post negotiation with him, well, that's what determines what's fair and what's not fair. How he responds to that emotionally or otherwise, that's completely up to him. And there are some people who are on the other end of the fairness spectrum. So there might be a situation where the person who's benefiting more still feels more hard done by. They feel an injustice towards them, even though they're getting the best part of the end of the stick. Well, they might feel like it's unjust, but they're benefiting more. So there's a discrepancy there that needs to be resolved. So they can feel hard done by, or that there's been an injustice, but in actuality, there's been justice and they've probably got more out of it than they deserved. So you can't, I think if you're using emotions to determine outcomes, it's very, very shaky ground, shaky ground.
I can see that now. It's, what I should be aiming at is the thing that I really want from this. And that's what I should be focusing on. I want fairness, because at the end of the day, we had an agreement, and the laws in California say nobody can work for free, right?
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Yep.
I don't want to pay you nothing for something that you have done, but you haven't delivered. And so based on that, I think I'm being generous by saying I'm giving you 2 days, and I'm comfortable with that. He priced himself when he sent me his proposal for what he thinks I owe him. He mentioned that the average national sales manager gets paid on average $120,000 a year, and so based on those numbers, he should be getting $4,000 a month. And let's just be, how did he say? Let's just be generous here, and we'll say let's go half of that. You owe me $4,200 and blah 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 blah, like including mileage and whatnot. But we have been very clear in establishing that you were someone who had no sales experience, and so with my intention of I want this to be a fair outcome for me just as much as for you, I went and looked it up, and a salesperson in San Diego, the range of sales of numbers of salaries from $18,000 to $153,000, and that number includes commissions and bonuses. Right. And so I said to him, you have zero sales experience. So at the very best, you get the lowest end of that market, which feels fair to me. You haven't got any experience. And on top of that, you didn't execute on anything that you said that you would execute on.
You may not want to go into it too much in this forum because it might prejudice what happens, but I would... Well, firstly, what did the contract say? I think you hinted at it was a verbal agreement, so that hurts a bit, because then it's a bit wishy-washy. But my understanding from how you described it was the agreement was based on he only gets payment for delivering a certain outcome, and he hasn't delivered the outcome. So I don't even know why you would even take it to the next step of considering anything. It's an outcome-based agreement by the sounds of it, not a time-based agreement.
The only reason is because the law in California says that you can't work for free, because that's equivalent to slavery. Okay. And that's why, again, like, my focus is fairness here. You haven't been fair to me, bro. You didn't show up to work when you said you were going to show up. You want me to pay you for 2 weeks worth of work. You didn't give me 2 weeks worth of work. And the days you did turn up to work, you weren't really present anyway.
Yep.
And you didn't deliver. Like, how about we sit down, have a conversation, and come to a fair agreement here?
Good. And that would be the assertive way of doing it, Lee.
Well, and his response to, as I said, his response is, we will not be having a conversation. And so I said, well, if that's the case, well, and I'm happy to go to the board of whatever it has to go to. I have written everything down. I've written down the meetings you didn't turn up to. I've written down the days that you took off. Like, I'm happy to go and present my case to any board, because I'm not going to allow myself to be walked all over. Previous versions of me would have been quite passive and said, look, Lee, you might just want to get rid of this, and like, let's not make too much noise about this, and just give him what he wants. But he's counting on that.
Okay, but he doesn't know who he's dealing with yet. And look, you've been, if what you want is a fair outcome, that's fantastic. That's a wonderful, positive goal. And you've done the calculations, you've got the figures, you've got the data about what he did and what he didn't do. I would think that would be quite helpful in alleviating your anxiety, because whether it goes to a board or a court of law or whatever, what the decision maker is going to be looking at is whether or not there is a fair and reasonable proposal, which I believe you have made, and whether or not the parties respectively have been willing to discuss and negotiate it. Now, you have been and he hasn't been. So you're winning on both fronts. You're presenting a fair and reasonable proposal according to your data and your research, and you're willing to sit down and discuss it further to potentially negotiate something that's slightly different from that, but not too far away from what you think is fair and reasonable. So he's deciding not to engage in that process and to sue you or whatever he's doing. Well, that's a completely aggressive act, and let him do it. Because
Absolutely.
He'll be shown up for that sort of behaviour, and it won't go down well.
I guess, going back to my conditioning and my tribal thinking, and my tribal conditioning, I guess, this idea of having to go up and present my case to the elders in this situation being the court system, the judge, all of that.
Right.
It induces a sense of panic, because it culturally, I guess, for it to escalate to that position is shameful.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
Right.
And so on some level, there is an association from a tribal conditioning perspective of, you've already caused shame if something should have to be aired out in public. And so that's where the anxiety comes from. So it's my I think for a second there I forgot that we're actually publicly having this conversation. I knew that would happen. I have to keep myself aware that you and I are having this conversation in public, because I almost let his name out. But it's this idea that if I'm going to take mine and his business in front of somebody else, one, I'm inconveniencing the elder, and two, who are you to feel that you have the right, you being me, to feel that you have the right to inconvenience the important people in the community?
Well, that's tricky.
I'm sure that this is foreign to somebody like you, because you don't think tribally. Like no. That's not the way.
Well, not only that, but even if I did think tribally, I'm unlikely to be in the same position as you, being a male, right?
And the fact that he's a male also has its triggers for me, being raised in the Arab community.
sure. My short suggestion would be take a support person with you if it gets to that point.
You want to come on? You want to get on a plane, Jamie Berry?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Well, you know, I'm always looking for excuses. So. An excuse to get you out here. But yeah, you're right.
So a support person would help immensely in that situation. But the other thing that might help you intellectually, and that's not going to cut it, but it might help a little bit, is what I would suggest is get a piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, and then on one side write tribal as the header, and on the other side write down whatever context this is going to go through. You mentioned the board. I don't know what it's a board of, or if it's a court of law, and then write down some of the governing principles. So in a tribal community, it might be don't bring shame on the tribe and various others, and hopefully that exercise will help show you that even though it feels the same as being in that tribal cultural context, it's actually different. And I'm guessing that it will actually be different, but I'm pretty sure it will be. And I think that the principles that govern that council or board that you would need to make your case against would be fairness and, accurate record keeping, and so they would be the values that govern that body. And if you can appreciate that the values are different, even though it feels like the same sort of situation for you, that might help you a little bit.
So with regards to that, are you still there, Jamie Berry?
I am, but I can't believe it's on low battery, but let's persist.
Well,
do I have to have headphones for this?
If you want to plug it in and then we can see how it goes without the headphones, that'd be fine.
Right.
Let's see how that goes.
It's such an inconvenient thing, isn't it?
It really is.
Listening.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can.
Perfect, Jamie Berry. And so here's the other aspect of that, and I want to bring it back around to gender. This idea that as a woman and the conditioning that women have received, I sense that we're going to get into Jordan Peterson territory here. But the conditioning that I have been exposed to, as well as the gender role that I tend to fall into, and I'm working very hard. I've been working very hard at it, as you know, for like 15 years now, to break those stereotypes within my own life. The fact that a man is being an aggressor towards me, and then I'm going to have to go most likely in front of a male judge and be judged by that male, is also creating anxiety. That when I feel anxiety, you know me as an empath, like it's always debilitating for me. Right. So my question there is, like, does the science show that women experience greater levels of anxiety around other people that are assertive to them? Like, what would a male generally do in this situation? Is a male more likely to be like, fuck you, bro? No, you're not going to do this to me.
These sorts of questions are always fraught, and so we don't. So that
we are generalizing.
We can be. So that we're as clear as we can be. When you ask me, what would a male do? My interpretation of the answer you want is, on average. What would the male response be?
Thanks for the clarity.
Noting that there is huge overlap between males and females, and the outliers on either end kind of might bring those group differences apart a little bit. So I think that a typical male response, as opposed to a typical female response, would probably involve less anxiety, definitely. We know that in general, females suffer from anxiety disorders at almost twice the rate of males. So anxiety is definitely associated with being female. And in those situations, I think particularly so. So the average male response, I think, would be more in line with what's the reality rather than
the feeling.
What does it feel like? And that's certainly my natural inclination. And emotions are important, and they're more important that they're guiding you in the right direction. So just like I gave you the spider example, and that's a really clear example of irrational, emotions driving irrational behaviours. So in this context, I accept and acknowledge that due to whatever conditioning and background experiences you have had, that could be a very anxiety-provoking situation. But rather than focusing on how it feels and then acting on the basis of that, I would encourage you to think about what the actualities are, and that is that third party is invested in resolving a dispute. So there's two parties to the dispute. You're seeing things completely differently. It's that third party's role to resolve that dispute in some way. And again, I would expect and imagine that a primary way they would do that would be to look at the evidence. Now, you've already gathered the evidence. You've done all of that. And whether it's me or a male or a person driven less by how things might seem or feel, I would rest assured that I've got the evidence, and that's all that matters in this situation, even though it might feel difficult or anxiety provoking. And so just knowing that you've done your homework will probably help you feel more assured that it's going to go your way, and hopefully reduce the anxiety around it.
I tend, you know me, with when it comes to doing hard shit, I'm somebody who tends to be like, all right, so you're feeling anxiety. That means this is hard. You've got to step into it. You've got to be desensitized to this. You've got to just learn how to get comfortable with the discomfort of this new behavior that you're trying to learn how to do. And I'm aware that there's like 40 plus years of conditioning that I'm trying to rewrite with this.
So my other suggestion, and this is one of those weird ones I make from time to time. It's not that weird, but it might seem weird. Role play it.
Oh yeah.
Get two males, get one to dress up in a judge's outfit and really play the role and put a beard on him and all the rest of it. The more it seems like the real situation, the better. And then get your adversary to also be male and ask him to be aggressive in ways he has been so far, and role play it several times, because yes, you've learned a different way throughout your life. Actually role playing it will work so much better than just thinking it through. Thinking it through might make a little bit of a difference, with the strategies I've suggested and some others. But actually being in that situation and observing your emotions change with every successive role play you do, that would almost guarantee that you'll have no issue with it. Because you can just role play it to the point where you've got no more anxiety left. And the remarkable thing that tends to happen in those situations is when you get rid of the anxiety around situations like that, you start to feel excited about it, and you won't be able to wait to bring it on, because you're just going to have so much fun with it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's I think a good way forward.
I'm excited about getting to that part of learning how to be assertive. I feel like I've been practicing it for a couple of years now, and at some point the anxiety is going to stop. Like, this idea of you deserve this, Lee, it's this self-worth thing that, look, tribal environments teach you to sacrifice your own self-worth for the sake of the tribe. So you have to reteach yourself a sense of self-worth. And feeling that you have the right to stick up for yourself is one of those things where you have to put a lot of effort into feeling like you deserve this.
Yeah, that's right. So you've got to believe it, and you've got to believe that you have the right to do that. So again, another part of assertiveness training is about people becoming more acquainted with their rights. Some people actually believe they don't have the right to speak up.
Well,
and
yes, like, I come from a culture that teaches women they're not allowed to speak up.
And so when you're in that culture, well, maybe you observe the rights of that culture, maybe you don't, in which case you'd stir things up. But you don't live in that culture, Lee. You
No,
live in
I
a
don't.
very different world, and there's a very different rights profile. Whether you're a male, female, transgender, older person, younger person, doesn't matter. You've got a right to say your thing and be heard and be taken seriously. And conditioning's one of those things where you won't really learn a different way until you've practiced it lots. So you've got to kind of uncondition yourself, or condition a new set of behaviours.
Do you think the definition of, well, this is going to sound strange, but you'll get it. Do you think that the definition and the requirements around assertiveness are going to change based on this idea of millennials and Gen Xers being so coddled? Do you think that they're going to be able to deal with people being assertive with them?
Don't know. It's another don't know answer to one of your good questions. Why would you suggest that?
Because in my observation, in my own life, and the example we've been just talking about is one of them, and the things that I've been observing from business owners, they can't expect things. Well, they can, but they find if they expect the same things from those generations than they would expect from themselves or their peers, they get a very different outcome.
Right.
So for example, if I was to expect, if I was to expect a certain level of work from a Gen Xer, they will, and I was assertive to that expectation, I would probably get, you know what, listen, I know I agreed to do that and I haven't lived up to what I need to live up to. Let me take care of it. Right? Whereas with a millennial or a Gen Z, what you'll tend to get is, I can't cope with that, so I'm not going to do it. You're expecting too much from me.
Right. So the way I'd approach that is control what you can control, and what you can control from an assertiveness perspective is the clarity end of the clarity side of things. And so if you're talking about an employer-employee relationship, then have even more clarity around the contract or what's expected of your employee, so that you've got some hard kind of standards to keep the person accountable to. And if they can't cope with your feedback that they're not working according to those standards, well, you're in a position to performance manage them or move them on, and you'd be in a more comfortable position to do that. So that's talking about it from at the perspective of an employer.
from the perspective of the employee, if they're really motivated to be where they are in that job, in that hypothetical scenario, well, it's going to serve them better to accept the constructive feedback than not to accept it. But at the end of the day, they've got the choice of moving on, if that's going to be the repercussion of them not doing what they're meant to do, and then they lose out. And that's fine. Like, both scenarios are fine, as long as there's clarity about what happens if the person doesn't, do what they say they're going to do.
And that sounds all very rational, right? It sounds logical and rational, and that's the way I would expect it to go if the employer and the employee in that situation were both Gen Xers or baby boomers. But what ends up happening when the employee is a millennial or a Gen Z is that they break down. They don't have and I'm generalizing here, but I'm generalizing from a lot of anecdotal evidence that's going on in our industry right now. And I hear employer and manager after employer and manager, a lot of them also being millennials who seem to have been parented by, they've grown up under struggle. And so they have this unusual millennial grit that doesn't seem to be as present as you'd want to see. Despite the fact, and I have said it on the podcast before, Angela Lee Duckworth's research into this suggests that there hasn't been enough evidence yet to show whether, and correct me if I'm misspeaking here, Jamie, but from what I understand, her research shows that millennials aren't old enough for us to know whether it is actually an issue with grit, or it's just that the age group that they're in, they haven't had enough time to exhibit the levels of grit that they should be exhibiting based on their age.
You sound like you're more across that literature than I am, but that makes sense to be cautious about that, because there could be an age effect in addition to a generation effect,
right,
when it comes to grit. So one of the options is the person breaks down. They can't handle the feedback. I would say,
and we're experiencing a lot of that. That's why I bring it up. Like, I hear managers say to me, and they contact me all the time, why the fuck do I have to high five every millennial when they pull an espresso shot? It's a part of their job.
Yeah, well, then the responsibility of, so you've got employees who want constant praise, right? It's just not practical for a manager to give that constant praise. But not only is it not practical, it's unhelpful. It will actually make the problem worse. And that's based on classical behavior theory, which is if you provide lots and lots of positive reinforcements for any behavior, you're going to make that behavior more likely. But once you withdraw the reinforcements, the behavior will dip straight away. Right?
So there's a backlash.
It will extinguish rapidly. And so maybe that's what the phenomenon you're talking about. But if you give intermittent reinforcement, so a thank you once every 2 weeks, or a smile, or much milder forms of that of praise in the form of showing your gratitude for your employees, that's actually going to build a more robust set of behaviours consistent with, I imagine, what you want in an employee. So I would suggest that, for employers or managers who are in this situation, I would suggest that they preface the constructive feedback conversation sufficiently well. And that might include a message about, firstly, I'm here to support you and your growth. I want to see you grow as an employee, possibly also as a person.
Mm-hmm.
2, in order to grow, from time to time, I'm going to give you some constructive feedback that might actually be very hard for you to hear, but I assure you I'm giving that feedback because I want you to grow. And it's worth
Stating
kind of
that.
emphasizing that message, because that's kind of the weak point, right? That in your scenario. I'm going to give you praise when I think you've done something particularly well, right? So you're setting up a kind of relationship where you're laying down the expectations as clearly and openly and honestly as you can.
And is that done at interview?
Well, maybe not in the interview, but early on. So
Okay.
After
orientation,
training, or could be part of the orientation and training process. That way, you're being crystal clear about what your behaviour is going to be, and importantly, what it's going to mean, right? So when I give you constructive feedback, so when I tell you, oh, actually, no, you're not meant to do that, I'm doing it because I want to watch you grow. I want to support you. I'm not doing it because I want to destroy your self-esteem, right? I want to support you to grow. I want your skills repertoire to grow, or your general skills to grow. So I think they're important conversations to have at the very, very beginning, not a week in, not 2 weeks in, as early as possible in the engagement process, so that if and when, as you put it, the employee starts to break down, right? Because the breakdown probably, well, it could be a catastrophic all or nothing thing, but you'll probably notice signs of it. At that moment, as quickly as possible, remind the person, if you haven't already prefaced that conversation, with the fact that I'm sharing with you some ideas to help you develop and help you grow. And if the person still has the breakdown, well, maybe it just wasn't the right fit, or maybe it's their prerogative. They can have a breakdown, and maybe you don't want people like that. I don't believe all millennials or all Gen Zs are like
they're not.
at all.
But there is a vast majority in our industry that are like that. And the example that I just gave you of the guy who was working for me, the first day orientation, I went through in detail what our culture is, the way we communicate with each other, what's expected during communication. Feedback will be with clarity, but always done with the best of intentions, because if you win, the business wins. We conspire to your success here. And if there's ever anything that you need, like, it's your job to communicate that to us openly and with assertiveness, so that we can be of clarity. It's one of our life currencies, clarity. And I went through all the life currencies that we have and why we have them and what we want, how we use those life currencies to help you along the way in your job. Because, as a salesperson, if you succeed, everybody succeeds. And, it's clear that this was set up for failure from the beginning, because, while his mouth was telling me, I get it, I'm on board, I'm excited, blah, 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 there was no follow through with any of that. And it's frustrating and infuriating. And the more people I have conversations with about their staffing situation, the more and more I'm hearing this happen. What adds to that is that in this country, in the US, baristas are typically paid minimum wage. And so the incentive for them to want to show up with passion and excitement is diminished. Because why should I show up with all of me if you're paying me barely a livable wage?
Right.
So it's a chicken and an egg scenario, Jamie. If employees were given the skills to sell more and to generate more revenue, well, then they could fund their own pay rise. But because they're not being paid adequately, they don't want to put the effort into doing a better job. You don't pay me enough to do the best that I can do. Yes, but if you did the best you could do, I could afford to pay you more.
But this is where the scientific mindset can really help employers, and you've got that mindset, and it's kind of close to what you've done with this employee, and that is you've laid out a hypothesis. The hypothesis is if you do extra work of this type and this quantity, and the outcome for the business is this quantity, then you'll get a pay rise of this quantity. And now that could go poorly because maybe your hypothesis was wrong. Maybe if they increase the quality of their work or the output of their work, you don't actually get greater sales.
Results. Yep.
So that's possible. So you need to account for that and have a contingency for that. But the clearer you can be about what your expectations are, and you and many employers would be good at knowing what tweaks you'd need to make to the business to get greater output or sales. And if you just make it a proposal and a trial, 1, 2, 3 months trial, you can't go wrong. And as long as the person agrees at the get-go that all of the possible outcomes are agreeable to them, then you've got a wonderful partnership. You really can't go wrong with it, right? So it might be you run the experiment, they work a bit harder or differently, and there's no change in sales. As long as you provide them with something additional for that extra work they've done, well, they might be satisfied with that. If you get the increase in sales, wonderful, they get a permanent pay rise.
Yep.
And if it doesn't work, well, it was worth a try. Let's just try a different hypothesis next time. But I think a lot of it is about getting that clarity from the get-go rather than working it out along the way. If people know what they're signing up for and what the possible outcomes could be and they're happy with it, well, they're generally going to be happy. And if anything goes wrong along the way, and then they start to get stroppy with you or argumentative or like has happened with you, well, if you've got the clarity of what you said you would do given different scenarios, then it's easier for you to be accountable and to hold them accountable.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting for me to see how this goes. I've already spent so much time focusing on, I live by the saying, everything happens for you, not to you. And, I went on a gratitude walk and I'm like, now listen, Lee Safa, what is the great things that have come out of this? And I realized that I am just going to learn how to sell. It's funny because, every year I set myself a hard task, a really hard task. And this year I decided I was going to figure out a way to increase revenue for the business. That was my hard task. It's the thing that I struggle with the most. And my strategy for that was to hire salespeople. Let me deflect that hard thing that I want to do by getting somebody else to do it. And I thought, and I rationalized it with, well, you can't do everything, Lee. So, delegate, bring somebody on board. And now I've come to realize that that's not really doing it's not stepping into the hardness of what you're trying to learn. You're just coming up with a tricky workaround to that, because come the end of the year, if you had salespeople that were tasked with making this happen, then if those salespeople leave, you're still back at square one of where you were at the beginning of this year. And so, a big focus for me to balance out the anxiety of what I've been experiencing is to go for my gratitude walk and talk to myself about the idea of, all right, so you better get about the fucking business of learning how to sell this product. Nobody can sell it as good as you do. You've just got to get over your anxiety of doing that. And, you know, I've started, and
what's the anxiety based on?
The same shit that everybody that does sales experiences. Like, I got to start a cold conversation with somebody, you know, like I've got to, it's about vulnerability and ego, stepping into those things of like contacting someone and saying, do you want to buy my product? And being exposed to the vulnerability of hearing no.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah. So the tone you did it with then is the tone you don't want to be doing it with.
Okay.
Right? Do you want to buy my product? Very, very
right.
Not the right tone.
No.
And I can understand if you've never done sales before and all the anxiety that there must be around it. And again, practicing. So firstly, knowing what it is, knowing what you want.
Yeah.
Right? So you know your product better than anyone else.
Yep.
You know what you want, increase revenue. And instead of the situation being one of, oh, what if they say no? I'll be a little bit on the back foot, but you never know. They might say yes. Rather than that, go into it with, I know my product. I know how unique it is. I know how valuable it is. And who am I to deprive the world of
Elixir?
I'm not
absolutely.
A mission. Like, people need to know about this product,
and
just that knowledge is going to change your tone. But then practicing, you know, writing out a spiel and practicing it with the right tone, I think will take you several steps in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, my approach has been like my approach to sales is find people who it genuinely would benefit their business to have Elixir. I feel that we would genuinely partner well together, and the product would authentically fit in their business. And then just go to them and say, hey, I love what you're doing, and I think that there's an opportunity for us to work together. If you're open to it, I'd love to start a conversation. I think we could do magical things together. And so far, I'm actually, you know, there have been some really big people in the last couple of weeks that have been doing this that have come back and said, you know what, I'd really like to try what you've got going on there. I think it could really work.
Be careful of your goal and how you articulate it.
Okay.
Would be my suggestion.
Tell me more.
So your goal sounded like, I'd like to start a conversation.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like the goal to me. It's not the proximal goal. The proximal goal is to increase your sales.
Yep. And
that starting a conversation is a different thing. And you're very that way, Lee. You're very you're so eclectic, and you're so open in your thinking, and you love learning new ideas, and you love sharing things. And that's all wonderful and beautiful, and it's you know, one of the things that makes you. And that's a wonderful way of being and a wonderful skill set, if you like. But I don't think it's helpful if you've got the goal of increasing sales or revenue. That needs a much more convergent framework, right? Let's start a conversation. It's very divergent. It's very open-ended. I would be thinking, rather than let's start a conversation, something like, well, I think my product's a good match for your business. Why don't we give it a trial for 3 months and see what the customers think?
Oh, the only reason that we can't go down that route immediately is because we have a qualifying process for Elixir, and that's very public. You know, we've spoken very publicly. So when I'm reaching out to somebody, I want to make sure that they're a good fit for our brand and that we're a good fit for them And also because it's such a unique product, typically they have so many questions. What is it? How was it made? All of that kind of stuff before we even get close to do you want to place an order? So also when people see it, they're very intrigued by what it is. So they're very quick to say, oh, can you send me samples? And so we would get hundreds of people say, please send me samples. And so we had to shift our approach to, you have to pay for samples. And then what we will do is we will take everything that you paid for those samples and credit it against your first order.
Mm-hmm.
And people are very open to that because they understand, especially it's one of the qualifiers, to be honest with you. If somebody turns around and says, fuck you to that, well, I'm not going to do business with you anyway, because you can't see the value in doing good business. But it's all of the questions that are absolutely going to come from, do you want to buy Elixir? Their thing is like, well, hold up, I don't even know what Elixir is. And it looks beautiful and, the branding's fantastic, et cetera, but what is it? And what's the sound waves thing? So they usually have so many questions that I want to give them the opportunity. That's why I'm like, let's have a conversation. I also need to understand, like, my job as the ship steerer of the business is to make sure that we're going to do good business. And I want to make sure that I qualify people correctly. I want to make sure that they're going to pay their bills, that they're not going to be assholes to do business with, that they're going to represent the product well, because we're in the beginning of the history of what this brand is going to be to the world. And, a lot of the big companies are watching what Elixir's doing because they want to know if this is a company that they want to eventually buy. And so I have to be very careful with managing all of that. That's why, look at me rationalizing, after. So did you listen to that podcast that I told you about?
Yep.
What's the name of the podcast again? You got me onto it. You are not so smart. And it was an episode about rationalization. And this idea that people go into rationalizing and justifying. And I just heard myself doing it right then. And I'm like, what you got going on there, Miss Lee?
Yep, we do it all the time.
Tell me why we do it. Is it human? Is it human? Like, does everybody do it, or does certain personality types do it?
No, everyone does it. I didn't think that particular episode did a great job of explaining it. So they were talking about split brain patients and how so the split brain patients were patients in the 1950s through to the late 1960s who had corpus callosotomies.
That's a mouthful.
The corpus callosum is the fiber bundle that joins the right and left hemisphere of the brain. And these individuals had epilepsy, intractable epilepsy, so medication and other things didn't work to stop the seizures. So they had to have the corpus callosum, the fiber bundle joining both hemispheres, severed. And that reduced seizure frequency.
Do we know if they tried weed? Was that one of the, do we know if back then?
I don't think so. No, not to my knowledge. Although there is evidence that it works now. So they were left with essentially two brains. And a lot of what we know about how the left hemisphere is different to the right hemisphere comes from those studies of those patients. And so in that podcast, they were talking about how sometimes the right hemisphere might want something or feel something or be exposed to something. So if you flash a word or a picture into the left visual cortex by presenting it on the right, then only the left hemisphere can see or read that word, and vice versa. And so they had these computer displays, and there'd be one thing presented on the left side and one thing on the right side. And so both hemispheres would see unique information. And so when the information clashed, they would tend to make up stories that somehow incorporated the information, or if the left hand could write or draw or point, it would point to whatever was flashed in the right hemisphere, even though it's different to what the person says, which is generally mediated by the left hemisphere. Anyway, the long and short of all of that is, and what they were talking about on the podcast, is sometimes you want or feel or experience something, and let's say that's processed by your right hemisphere. Your left hemisphere may not agree with that, or it may have issue with that, but it can start to rationalize some inconsistent feelings or incongruent feelings that are coming from other parts of the brain. And when I heard the podcast, I was surprised they didn't mention Pennybaker, because he's done a lot of work on narrative and the importance of narrative in identity formation and guiding our behavior. But basically, the left hemisphere just makes sense of all of your thoughts and feelings and experiences, even when they don't make sense. So they were talking about on the podcast, even though after Donald Trump's inauguration, people felt better about him, or they rationalized that they felt better about him, even though they appreciated he didn't perform well during the inauguration speech. And that's because they're stuck with him for at least 4 years. He's the president, and so they might have some deep feelings of patriotism or pride to be an American, and they need to make sense of that because he's the president of America now. And so when they were surveyed post the inauguration, they rated him higher than they did pre the inauguration. So yeah, the left hemisphere rationalizes it, basically creates an ongoing story that makes sense of your world as you experience it.
That gives me a thought. Is it possible that this employee that we were just talking about is rationalizing what am I trying to say here? It's almost as though he has to rationalize realizing that it's a few things. So he knows he hasn't done a good job. He told me that his personal life is the reason he hasn't done a good job. And he couldn't bear the thought of not being given another chance to do a good job and redeem himself. Could this behavior of what he's exhibiting now be a form of rationalization for me coming out and saying to him, well, bro, you didn't do a good job?
Absolutely. And it's that kind of anger mindset that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Something hasn't gone right. It's clearly not my fault. It must be your fault. And you're accountable, not me.
So that's aggressive, right?
It is. And it comes from, and that's actually a very good example, hypothetically, of poor self-concept being associated with aggressive behavior.
What is it? Poor self-concept?
Yeah.
So what's poor self-concept?
So he doesn't, maybe not this individual, but let's say a hypothetical individual, may be too afraid to look inwardly because they might find something that's not as worthwhile as they think is there. And so the inclination is to point to others when things go wrong. So it's like an aversion of doing introspection.
It sounds like evergreen state.
Maybe, yeah.
In the sense that when the mob comes together, and for anyone who doesn't know, look it up, evergreen state, what happened with Brett Weinstein. Was it Brett or Eric? I think it was Brett Weinstein. Check it out. You'll be horrified. But it's that kind of a thing whereby if they and I'm sorry, I totally derailed what you were saying, but
No, that's all right.
I do that a lot with you.
Am I allowed to get myself an instant coffee while I'm on your coffee podcast?
Oh dear. Well, you know, that or a soy latte with 1 sugar. You do really well with keeping up, Jamie Barry. I'm very impressed, but you do have the advantage. It's like 10 o'clock at night here. So
That was one of my...
it was part of your modus operandi to do it this way, wasn't it?
What?
To keep the conversation this way so that you had the edge. I can't believe you're making an instant coffee. That's so fantastic.
Is it a first ever on your podcast?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you want to tell us what you're using and how you're doing that? Is it Nescafe Blend 43? Oh, what is it? Moccona.
Classic medium roast, number 5.
We need to have a conversation about the coffee supply chain off this podcast, Jamie Berry, and the slavery that you're being complicit to by buying that coffee.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Wait, let me take that back. I'm not specifically saying that Moccona is creating slavery before I get sued. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that coffee that is purchased to go into instant coffees that are like that pay the equivalent of the C market. I'm clarifying for legal reasons here. It's the equivalent. It's the equivalent of almost nothing to cover production costs, and the farmers end up going out of business or having to pay their staff nothing. The pickers don't end up getting paid for a lot of this stuff. Anyway.
It's actually relevant to rationalisation, by the way.
Is it really?
I might know now a little bit more about the ethics around that coffee, but my body really feels like a coffee now. And so I can either feel like a very unethical person or somehow rationalise that maybe it's not that unethical for some other reason. And I'm not going to do it now, but that's how rationalisation
Did you bring your coffee?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, excellent. You've touched on something really important here. We in our industry are trying to figure out a way. There's a group of us that are trying to figure out a way that we can help get the general public to understand how their buying practices are affecting the coffee supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And we're trying to figure out what messaging we can construct, and I'm trying to put a project together around it because I don't have enough projects going on right now.
No.
We're trying to bring a few people together to put a project together that we can present to the public that helps them understand that by buying Nescafe and by buying Moccona and by buying Folgers, you are almost certainly bringing this commodity into the bracket of down the track being a boutique product. So to give context, the C market, which is the futures market that coffee is traded on, or commodity coffee, not specialty coffee, but commodity coffee primarily is traded on the C market, is trading today at 92 cents per pound. It was recently told it was recently explained at SCA in Boston. That's just a coffee convention, the biggest coffee convention in the world. It was recently presented that it costs somewhere around $2.80 a pound to produce.
Wow.
Right?
Mm.
And so this is not the first time it's been this low, but it is a 13-year low, and it is around the same price as what it was 30 years ago.
Mm.
And so historically, when the market drops this low, it rebounds and rebounds hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so to give you some further context, the specialty market, which is where the coffee scores higher on the scale of 0 to 100, it's better quality coffee, and it is sold through relationships between the farmer and the importer, or the farmer and the roaster. So they're direct relationships. And we just, with our first attempt at buying directly from the farmer, we bought an organic coffee, and the green price that we paid for it was $5 a pound. That's what it actually costs to buy that at a fair price. And he was giving me a good deal.
Wow.
So what's happening is that these commodity crops, the farmers are realizing that they're actually going to make more money from planting macadamia trees. So I'm going to cut down my coffee plantations. I'm going to cut down the commodity coffee. I'm going to keep the specialty coffee, but it makes no sense for me to grow commodity coffee, because the Koreans are coming in and paying for my macadamia crops today when I'm planting the trees, knowing that they're not going to see any return on their investment for 7 years.
Wow.
And so what we want to do is we want to find a way to help the general public understand that I know that you've been buying Moccona or Nescafe or whatever it is for, 20 years. You drink it every morning. But your behavior or your buying practices are going to mean that product is either going to go out of, it's going to potentially be more expensive, or it's going to be limited in supply. And what like when I speak to people about it, they say, you know what, like I don't feel as comfortable about drinking this coffee, knowing that me buying this coffee means that I'm contributing to slavery. But yet they'll go back and buy the same coffee.
Yeah.
And is that a rationalization thing, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. And it's a convenient, it's too easy to conveniently ignore those facts when you're not really confronted by it. Like with the cigarette people, what they did is they started putting images, and really visceral images, of the harms of cigarette smoking, and that's ostensibly resulted in a decrease in smoking behaviour, quite a significant one.
So it worked.
Oh yeah.
Awesome.
I think smoking rate in Australia is somewhere between 10 and 12% at the moment, and in the 1970s it was up around 75%.
Wow.
That's come down significantly.
Well, God, a packet of cigarettes costs about $50 now in Australia.
Oh, it's crazy. So I think I can know that. I know that now, but I also know that's not enough for me to stop drinking Moccona coffee. And that might sound really horrible, but every time you've said you might be supporting slavery, I've had this whiff of negative emotion, like, oh, that doesn't feel good. So I think in terms of the behaviour change that you're after on a wide scale would require associating the idea of supporting slavery with the coffee drinking or the coffee buying experience, and obviously no one's going to be motivated to do that. So that's a tricky one. That's really, I don't know if there's an easy solution to that.
It is a lot of this stuff sounds like trickery and like manipulation. It's why I don't like marketing, because I feel like a lot of it is manipulation of what people's perspective of something should be. You're kind of up against it. It doesn't feel fair. Like, I get it. Look, I'm a fan of competition. I think that conscious capitalism is awesome. But when you're presenting, like, marketing agencies and advertising firms bring on board psychologists to help them learn how to manipulate people, right?
Well, they bring on psychologists to help them increase their sales and revenue.
Through manipulating people.
Well, it depends on how you define manipulation. Yeah, and there are some things that are clear examples of manipulation that have been outlawed, like subconscious, what do they call it? Subliminal advertising. That was banned in, I think, the 1970s, because that is much more blatant manipulation, because the person's not even aware of the cues, and those cues can alter their behavior. So I would see that as outright manipulation. But if you're talking about, say, Coca-Cola associating their product with healthy, happy, young, attractive people on their ads, I wouldn't see that as the same degree of manipulation, because if you've got a critical mindset, well, you can see what they're doing. It's quite obvious. There's actually a very good program on television in Australia on the ABC called The Gruen Transfer. I think they changed its name. I think it's just called Gruen now. And that shows all about the sort of tricks that might be used in advertising. But you can learn those tricks, and they're, once you know what the tricks are, they're quite obvious if you've got a critical mind what they're doing. So I wouldn't see that as manipulation. I'd see that as, that using fair and available in the public domain variables of human behaviour to present something in a certain light. But how I know you're laughing because you either don't agree with me or
I just am really enjoying watching you rationalize this. It's how it's not manipulation.
But honestly, how is you got to draw a line somewhere, right? So so you're wearing lipstick. Is that a manipulation? Do you want me or your viewers to think something other than you because you're wearing lipstick and have long hair? You're changing a natural state in some fashion, possibly I don't know why you're doing it.
Just to make the record straight, the reason I am wearing red lipstick, I'm not trying to sexualize myself, as you so craftily just suggested without suggesting it. It's not a sexualization thing, it's a branding thing.
Exactly.
It's a branding thing. Straight hair, my long hair and red lips is a part of my brand. I'm not using it to sell myself, which is just preposterous.
You make it sound more wrong.
Oh, Jamie Berry. It's one of those things that, like I was looking into the history of how marketing started, and it was Freud's nephew who went to Freud, and he was tasked with selling cigarettes.
Right.
Do you know this story?
No, I don't.
Yeah, so God, I hope I don't fuck it up. So Freud's nephew was tasked with selling cigarettes, and he didn't know how to do it. So he went to his uncle and said to him, his uncle noticed that he was troubled by something, and he said to him, well, I have to learn how to sell these cigarettes and I don't know how to sell them. He said, well, who are you trying to sell them to? And he said, we're trying to get, men to buy them because men are the ones that smoke. And he said, oh no, if you want to get men to buy the cigarettes, what you should be doing is having women in the advertisements with the cigarettes in their mouth. And it's a phallic subliminal suggestion. Freudian. It does, right? And so that's where marketing started.
Okay.
And, that's the classic manipulation there. So what it did was it got women to buy cigarettes and men liked their women smoking because of the phallic suggestion that was behind it.
Wow, fascinating.
So I back to the subliminal thing though. Do you remember the McDonald's campaign that ran whereby they had a phone number in the ad that barely anybody could see? Do you know this?
No.
So
No.
I was sitting on the couch with my now ex-husband, and he said, "Why have they got a phone number in the background?" I'm like, "There's no phone number anywhere. Where are you seeing a phone number?" He's like, "Look, can't you see the phone number?" And I couldn't see it. No matter how many times I watched the ad, I couldn't see it. The ad comes on one time, and I said to him, "Get up there and point to the phone number on the TV." And when he pointed it out, you could see that in the background, until you're aware of it, you'd never see it.
Wow.
We wrote the phone number down, and I called the phone number, and less than 1% of the population can actually see the phone number. They're trying to find people whose brains work that way so that they can recruit them to help them figure out how to advertise to the rest of the population.
Wow. How long
Isn't
ago
that
was
fascinating?
that?
Well, I was married, so it was more than 10 years ago. I was happily married at that point, so it was about 14 years ago. Yeah, it was about 14 years ago, but it was fascinating. And when I asked them, "Is it legal for you to do this?" she hung up the phone. Because I didn't think it was legal to actually do that kind of a thing. But, up until that point, she was telling me, "Oh, it's a creative marketing endeavor. We're looking for people who could recognize it. Was it what exactly did you see?" And I said, "Well, actually, it wasn't me. It was my husband." And she wanted him to come in. They would pay him a lot of money for his time because it's so hard to find people that could do it.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I'm not saying, I'm not suggesting that marketers are squeaky clean and don't want an outcome, but I'm not opposed to the methods they use by and large. I think it's just an extension of, say, well, I was going to say putting your best foot forward, but it's more than that. It's about branding, as you've acknowledged, with your own...
With my lipstick.
Appearance. Yep. And it's about associating certain ideas or concepts or images with the brand. I don't get too hung up on that being a form of manipulation.
Is that a rationalization right there?
Is it a rationalization? No, I don't think so. I've actually given it thought before. I think it's fair play. Otherwise, what's marketing going to be? It'll be uninteresting and unexciting and
a fair playing field and all that. Look at me being a bit liberal.
Well, what we haven't covered yet, Lee, which we've touched on it, is competition. And
I'm totally exposing myself throughout this episode, aren't I?
Well, you've alluded to it. Alluded to it. So, and you've also alluded to the fact that fairness and fair play are very strong values of yours.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe the difference we in perspective we have about this marketing issue, you viewing it as manipulation, me viewing it not necessarily as an egregious type of manipulation, if that, might come down to a competitive element.
Absolutely.
And you and I do see that very differently. So
I'm trying, Jamie Berry. I really am trying to learn how to be competitive and what vein fits me with regards to competitiveness, because I don't think it's a one size fits all kind of thing.
It's not a one size fits all, but I think it's such a normative and healthy thing to have competition, because when you have competition, you have clear, well, I'll use the term winners, even though that's sometimes seen as a dirty word these days, but you have a clear delineation of what's better and what's worse in that particular game. And that's a very useful construct. It's
I agree.
very, very useful to know who or what is better at this particular thing than
careful
the
with
other
that
who's
word, Jamie Berry. You're going to get yourself into trouble.
Because I said better, but I'm
it's very uncool now.
I know.
Just that anyone's better than anybody else. How dare you?
Exactly.
You're being racist and sexist and ageist and all of those things now.
Absolutely. Well, bring it on. So I think it's useful and important to know who or what is better at a particular skill or endeavour or outcome. And it's really unhelpful to have fuzziness in that concept. And that's where competition comes from. And I know there's a lot of opposition to the idea of it in our...
Especially now.
Contemporary society. But I really think we're losing out by eliminating or reducing competition or competitiveness. I think a big part of it comes from some competition being vile and unfair and basically those things. I'm opposed to that, but I'm all for fair competition, and I want to know, what's best, what's second best, what's third best, and what's not great. And it applies in the coffee world. It applies in every endeavour. So they're my preliminary.
And this is the thing about the coffee supply chain. We kind of want it to be fair on the back end of the supply chain, in equal proportions to what it is on the front end of the supply chain, because roasters are buying coffee for, let's say, on the high side of average to be around $2 or $3 a pound, and are eventually, so when they roast it and they sell it, if they're selling it wholesale, they're selling it at $11 a pound, and if they're selling it retail, it's around $18 a pound. And so on the back end of the supply chain, people are not getting paid enough to cover their production costs. Whereas on the front end of the supply chain, or the step before the front end of the supply chain, the front end being the cafe have not been able to raise their prices in years, but the cost of coffee is going up, which is hindering them as well. But that step before that, which is the roaster, they're making this huge chunk of profit. And what I want to create a campaign around is that either the roasters start paying more for their coffee and ensuring that that money goes to the farmers, not the importers. Like, it needs to be paid farm gate, FOB, which is free on board. Pay either more for the coffee or support the farmer by buying equipment for whatever it is that they need to help sustain the supply chain. Otherwise,
why can't the farmer just sell it at an increased cost?
Because a lot of them are tied to the C market. So because they're tied to the C market, their coffee is purchased on the futures market. So it's sold at that price sometimes before it's being picked. So,
but why can't they as a collective just agree for that price to be higher?
Well, because they don't have the education to do that. And this is what's starting to happen by the work of some great importers around the world and some roasters. There are some great roasters that have decided to buck the system and go directly to the farmer and create relationships with them and say, I really like your coffee. I want to help unhook you from the ties that you have to the C market. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to negotiate a contract with you that buys you, that I'm beholden to for 3 years. So I'm not just going to buy this crop. I'm going to buy the next 3 years worth of your crop and commit to paying you at the time that you deliver the coffee. And what's going to happen there is that if you provide coffee that scores higher than what you agree, I'm going to pay you a premium on top of that.
So,
but go ahead.
I can't help think, and I might have some of the details wrong, and I don't understand necessarily the futures market elements that well, but that seems to me quite disempowering, because it's requiring the importer to act to proactively support the farmer, who is in the worst situation in this equation.
They're the passive player in this. Yes.
Exactly. So when you say that there isn't the education at the farmer level, I would also hazard to say, bringing back the very first thing we spoke about, there isn't the assertiveness at that level. I would aim the initiative there. Educate them about what's going on and train them to be more assertive, because then that's more empowering for them. They're not relying on the importer to the importer's goodwill gesture. From the importer's perspective, that exposes them, or that makes them less competitive, I imagine, possibly. Maybe somehow miraculously makes them more competitive. But to me, it sounds like they're going out of their way to help out the disadvantaged farmer, and they're risking, their profit margins or whatever being less. I don't think that's a healthy way to do it, because you're setting up a power imbalance in that very act itself.
Well, it's the saviour complex, isn't it?
It's the saviour complex, exactly. And I'm not a big fan of that. I'm not.
So
there's something for me that's a bit wrong about that situation.
So it's the idea that you teach the farmers assertiveness, and this, look, Map It Forward can play a role in that by, getting you to engage in this, one of the seminars that we're going to do for coffee farmers. And, we're in talks with people about that now. But it's this idea of what your suggestion is teach them the skills of assertiveness, help them understand the potential gains that they get from that, and help them learn how to do it. So, sorry, I'm thinking about 65 things of how that could go all at the same time. So what happens in that situation, you look at a company like Nestle, right? Nestle sells 6,000 cups of coffee per second.
Wow.
Between Nescafe and Nespresso and all the other derivatives of it, 6,000 cups per second. Mm-hmm. And so what the challenge is, these farmers don't know what the price of coffee is going to be when they've planted their crops. They get to the point of harvest, and we find ourselves in this situation that we're in at the moment, that the market has plummeted, and they have to do something with this crop, because they need to pay their wages. They need to pay land taxes. They need to pay for everything. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Some farms in Brazil, where a lot of their production is mechanized, they'll turn around and they'll just say, no, fuck it, we're going to put it into storage and we're not going to sell it until the market goes up. But the poorer countries, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Mm-hmm. And they're so poor that they're incapable of carrying that risk till the next harvest. Which right. is...
But
go on.
But why can't the futures price go up? Like, can they negotiate for the futures price to be higher?
No. Because the people who are trading the futures market are people stuck in New York that are just shuffling papers.
Right.
So it's a complex system, and I don't understand a lot of it, but I know that the farmer is not involved in that negotiation process, which is why this relationship buying thing is something that a lot of people are pushing. Like, if you like a coffee, go and make an offer directly to the farmer on that coffee.
Right.
But I definitely see where you're coming from, like an empowerment process whereby we can actually help farmers understand what the opportunity is for them so that they can be less dependent on the system that's clearly not working for them. It's colonialist.
Yeah, and it's, to me, it's basically about helping them understand the value of what they have to offer. Because if they're not getting fair recompense for what they're offering, well, that's not a great situation. And if they know what the value actually is, then they're in a better position to negotiate, and having some assertiveness skills will help with that.
Do you buy instant coffee because of its convenience? So if you had the opportunity to buy instant coffee that was more expensive, that didn't engage in these coffee buying practices, would you tend to move towards paying for the more expensive instant coffee?
I think it would depend on how much more expensive, if it's a small amount, probably.
Probably turns out to be $1 a cup, which is so much more expensive than what Nescafe is. So much more expensive. Which is why this is such a problem, because if you think about how much the reasonable price is for a cup of instant coffee, and then you understand what Nestle is charging for it, how shitty are the prices that they're paying these farmers?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is really, really interesting. Did you want to say anything else about competition?
Not necessarily, because I sense that you might not want to, or I don't have anything.
I'm fine.
I don't have anything in particular to say about it, but I know that we differ on it.
Well, my thing is that I think because of being raised in a tribal situation and a tribal mindset, competition is, again, one of those things that falls into the same category as boundaries. It's going against the tribal mindset to be competitive. It's also being competitive has a nuanced flavor to it of ego. So in a tribe, if you are going to step into competitiveness, you are placing yourself as worthy of that, right? Like you obviously think you can beat somebody, which is again anti-tribal. So you would never, in a tribal situation, you'd never compete with someone for anything unless you wanted to knock them down a peg or to assert a higher position in the tribe.
But I think it operates on different levels. So in a truly tribal culture, it's not necessarily anti-competitive, but the competition wouldn't be between individuals, it would be between tribes or between cultural groups, right? So there are some cultures that are very competitive, but winning is not about an individual winning. Winning is about that culture or that tribe winning above other cultures or tribes, right? So it's still a collectivist celebration, even though the individual might have achieved
and it typically expresses itself as war, right? I mean, the only kind of competition that tribes are going to assert against each other is war. Am I wrong?
No, I'm thinking about World Cup soccer, right? That's very tribal. That's one of the most tribal competitions on the planet. And yes, you're talking about teams, but when the Brazilian team win, then it's a celebration for Brazil. It's not. Well, yes, of course, the players are kind of elevated to godlike status, probably, but it's more about the culture winning. But when I don't know, maybe I need to think about it more, but it seems more about that tribe or culture being better at that endeavor than others, than individuals per se.
I have to understand, and I'm still going through that processing for myself of like why I used to play a lot of sports when I was a kid. And for me, I'm sure I had to have some element of competitiveness to do that because I was very good at it and was usually the captain of the teams that I was on. But I think it was one of those things of, it wasn't about winning. It was about, I wonder how well I can do this. Like, I wonder if I can actually get good at this. It wasn't, and it wasn't in a way that I was trying to beat myself or prove to myself that I could do this well. It was more like an experiment. And so I'm trying to find a way to cultivate more competitiveness in myself, even if it's just me being competitive against myself. And I've done that in very simple ways by, I'm looking down here at my to-do list. So I set myself, as in alignment with my, you've got to do something hard this year. And my hard thing is learning how to sell. So I set myself these targets of how many leads I need to generate every single day. And how many of those can I convert to sales? And it's like, I'm trying to see that as a little bit of a competition, but it's not. It's like, well, if it doesn't convert, that's fine. It's like an equation here. Something's going to stick. You'll fall into a rhythm, you'll figure it out, and you'll get it done. So I don't know what it is. Somebody they were very annoyed at the fact that I'm not competitive and very snippily said, you're more competitive than you realize. You just don't want people to think that you're competitive because it rubs off the shine that you've got. And I'm like, bro, it serves me better to be competitive. I would be better at business if I was competitive because I would be trying to do better than everybody else, but I just don't have it in me yet. I just don't know where I'm going to find that thread that I can cultivate to become like I don't want to turn into a competitive tyrant. I could never. Can you imagine me doing something like that, Jamie Berry? That would be hilarious.
But I think that's a thinking distortion, and not just one that you hold, but that probably a lot of people hold, which is the end point of competition is that you end up becoming that tyrant, and that you end up monopolizing, dominating markets or other people. But that's not what it means to me. What it means to me is getting or being better at something, and that includes competing with oneself. In fact, that's my favorite type of competition. And really what the competition is there is a competition between my present self and my future self. Which one's going to win? And if you don't have that hunger for your future self to be better, well, I see that as having an anti-competitive mindset. You've just got a lackadaisical, I'll accept things as they are sort of mindset. And
I like that word, lackadaisical. I've not heard that before. You've got great words, Jamie.
Carefree, not bothered.
No, it makes sense. And I wonder if, I've often thought like my fascination with puzzles could be, I just need to flip that and be like, okay, so your fascination with solving a puzzle could be flipped into, if you find a way to massage it, find a way to make it about a competition. So right now, if I'm to solve a puzzle, let's say I'm to solve a Sudoku puzzle, I don't assign a time frame to do it in. So it's just, I'm just going to solve it when I need to solve it. But perhaps if I start to add a timer into that situation, I could start to cultivate some competitiveness juices there.
So whether it's time or some other factor, I think what the actual underlying factor is some stress, actually, some stress, because time adds a bit of stress.
Yep.
And that might be enough to give you the juices to feel it in a different way. So yeah, you can do that. But yeah, I think if you like getting better at things, and I know you do, and you got better at so many things, and things that you were completely unacquainted with. I mean, you're a perfect example of someone who, you know, sets goals, and sometimes they're really ambitious goals, but you find a way to get there. Well, that's you being competitive. I know that you've disagreed with me in the past when I've suggested that, but that's at least one way that I see you as being competitive. You compete with yourself. And I think that's the basis of all competition. But I think that the part that you might struggle with, and I might be a little bit presumptuous here, is it's kind of similar to that tone you had with, do you want to buy my product?
Yeah, right. And I see where you're going there. It's accepting that I am being competitive.
And it might come from the communal and the tribal culture stuff as well, in terms of you don't want the ego associated with being better. But I don't think you fundamentally necessarily don't want to be better.
No, well, you know how hard I work. You know how hard I work and how hard like how pensive I am and how self-considered I am and how much I'm always reassessing, like, how can I be a better version of myself? And I hate to use that word better because I feel like it's a judgment, but I'm always looking at, you know, how to improve myself, which I guess is a very nuanced version of competition.
By the way, even if it is a judgment, what's wrong with that? Like, judgment's become a bad word, but judgment helps you delineate what you want from what you don't want. If you don't have good judgment, you don't have good clarity.
Yep. Yeah,
right?
No, I hear that. It's one of those things where I mean, you knew me when I was a kid. I was so fucking judgy as a kid. You know that. And so I worked so hard and I'm a person of, I swing from one extreme to the other, and it takes me a minute to keep swinging both ways until I get to the center somewhere. But this idea of better, as long as better is from my perspective about me, then I can bear the load of that judgment. But if I'm asking somebody else to be better, then that's a judgment that I don't feel that I have the right to enforce on somebody else, because that's my perspective of better, not theirs.
That's right. So firstly, better without qualifying it is not helpful, right? Because what does that mean? But if it's better at something, right, better at soccer, or better at making a cup of coffee, or a better coffee bean or blend or whatever, well, you're specifying and you're being precise about what the outcome is. And I don't see anything at all wrong with doing that. And then setting a goal about making that thing better in that particular domain. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Most people want better coffee and want better sport and want better. So yeah, I just don't have issue with it. And it's just a funny time we live in, where words like better and competition and judgment are dirty words.
Yeah. Me. I mean, it's going to get you into trouble, not you, but it will get you into trouble if you want to suggest that you are better than somebody.
Yeah.
Like
I'm not going to say,
sensitive.
I think when people hear I'm better than you, then really what that means is I'm a better person. And in modern psychological discourse, that means absolutely nothing, because persons are so complex that you can't have better or worse unless you've got the context to determine that, right? So, for example, if I am a highly agreeable person, well, I might be better at making persuasive arguments because agreeable people are better at persuasion. But that doesn't make me a better person. It might just make me, that quality of my personality might make me better at that particular endeavor. But
say that again. Agreeable people are better at persuasion.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you're more agreeable,
yeah,
you're more likely to, well, it sounds manipulative. Well, persuasion is manipulative.
Not. Yeah, well.
You just watched my brain go through 55,000 definitions of. That was the second delay in there. Sorry. That's, yeah. Anyway, go on. I'm sorry that I derailed that.
Just like imagine the scenario of the prototypical salesperson.
Yeah.
Right? And so what they try and do is make a connection with the person they're selling to.
Yeah.
And if they're agreeable, they're going to be much better at making that connection. Oh yeah, I thought that too. And oh yeah, and so agreeableness helps make that connection. Disagreeable people won't, but they'll say, they'll ruin a lot of sales opportunities because they'll just say it how it is. They won't be concerned with coming across as wanting to please or be seen as similar to that other person. So yeah,
so does that mean that I just need to go and find agreeable people to sell to?
Not to sell to. You capitalize on your agreeableness to make sales.
Right.
Yeah.
You heard it here first, folks. So we're coming up to 3 hours. Wow. How did that happen?
I don't know.
And this is actually a day off for you, sort of. So we should wrap it up there on me learning how to be agreeable, more competitive, more assertive, and less anxious. Sounds pretty standard for one of our conversations, isn't it?
That's right. You'll probably achieve them all in 3 weeks.
Yeah, that's being very generous, Jamie. Well, actually, yeah, you clearly do know me very well, Jamie Berry. Thank you. You are now well on the way to being the coffee psychologist. That is what I'm going to call you from now on. You know what? When you do finally get on social media, that should be your Instagram handle, the coffee psychologist.
Sure. Okay. Well,
I'm happy to take care of that for you. We'll get one of your PhD students to do it for you. All right, Jamie Berry, thank you so much for doing this. This was like a whole year in the making. Actually, I do want to mention that this is the celebration for our podcast turning 1. So, yeah, we turned 1 this week.
Congratulations.
And so, thank you. And yeah, that's why I wanted to do this podcast now, because, you know, it's you and the podcast is turning 1 and it's a big deal for you to come on here for me. So thanks for doing it. It means everything to me.
It was a pleasure and lots of fun as always, and really interesting seeing a visual of you whilst chatting as well. I don't know if you put your lipstick on when we have our YouTube chats, but
well, now you can just imagine it. Now you have a visual to associate with it. Not like you haven't seen me like regularly since we were 10, but that's okay. I didn't wear lipstick back then, but that's okay.
No. Yeah.
Thanks again, Jamie Berry. I'll speak to you probably tomorrow.
Okay.
Bye, love. I'll speak to you soon. Bye.